don't know how powerful your voice is. They don't want to hear another legislator. They don't want to hear somebody else that's advocated. Sometimes they just want to hear that personal story.
The only way to stop asbestos-related cancers is to ban it.
About 40,000 Americans die every year of asbestos-caused diseases. So this is our last panel, and it'll be 20 minutes of a conversation. It was organized and discussed by Perry, Ann, and Greg and I, so it should be information that the average person that might have exposure and or been diagnosed can benefit from their knowledge, the work they do. And to be honest, I want to end the shame of asbestos victims feeling like they shouldn't file a case because they're embarrassed that they've done something wrong. And it can be a very muddy place to be. So you guys introduce yourself, talk amongst yourself, as we say in Hollywood, and then we'll save 10 minutes for Q&A. Does that sound okay?
Sounds perfect.
Perfect. I'll be a good listener.
All right, so I'm just going to give a little format of where we're heading with this so you have a structure. I mean, you saw the agendas that we've had today. You've talked about medicine, science, legislation, lawsuits, civil lawsuits that individual families have had. And we're going to bring it to the cap at the end about how all of this together makes change. Well, civil litigation or lawsuits has an impact on companies, it has an impact to help families, but it does make a difference. And as Dr. Lemon had mentioned earlier, someone asked him a question about, well, when did this start happening that asbestos started to be used less? It was the lawsuits that pressured these companies to stop. You'll see interrogatories that say, we stopped using asbestos-containing products due to public pressure. That public pressure is through your voices and through the lawsuits. So today we're going to talk a little bit about where we've been with civil lawsuits. We're going to talk about where we're going. And if you saw the complaint that Martin Ditkoff put up there earlier, it was very blurry, but the lawsuit back then, 20 years ago, is very different from what you're seeing today. There's still some of those, but they're also very different. And then we're also going to talk to you. You all know you need a doctor when you're diagnosed with mesothelioma, and you go get the best treatment you can with physicians that we have here. But many people don't know that while they need a doctor, they also need a lawyer. They need a law firm. They need people behind them that are going to fight for them. And if you didn't get the message with what Barry, Dr. Castleman was talking about fighting, why people should be angry, why people need to step up, you heard all those things that he was saying about how they've lied, how they've manipulated data, how they buried information, how they exposed workers, and the epidemic they've caused of mesothelioma and other asbestos-related deaths. That's where you know we need to step up. So, Ann, take it from here on where we've been. Wherever you want to be.
Yeah, the sound will be better. I just put a generic 20 minutes. You guys share it.
Thank you, Perry, and look forward to this. So a little bit about where we've been, and I'm not going to go through all the legal cases that we have because I'd be like in a law school class, and I think this is what more of this is like what's really been going on. And I'm going to speak a little bit from the trenches. When I joined Motley Rice and its predecessors back 40 years ago, I was a paralegal, and I should start off with I'm from a law firm in South Carolina. I've been there 40 years. Motley Rice, we've grown and changed different law firms over the years, but the one thing we've done since the early 70s is fight the asbestos industry and represent asbestos victims. 7 offices in different states, and I have some of my colleagues with me today. But a little bit of today, a lot of today, all of today has really been a memory lane. And when we talk about where we've been, you've just heard it. I mean, everyone in this room has been a part of where we've been, and everyone in this room is about where we're going as well. But when I started, I love seeing some of the pictures, and I worked with Dr. Anderson and Dick Lemon and Barry Castleman and Arthur Frank and Dr. Molina. I haven't had the pleasure yet, but my colleagues have with you as well. But we were looking at the ceilings and the exposures, and we looked at where things came from. I was what I called a product ID investigator, and every one of our firms probably has them now. But what's so important in this litigation is whose tiles or what was above the tiles, whose spray was on the ceilings, whose, decorative things were on there, what was in the boiler room. And I started when I came down in 1984 working with the school district. So I always say before I represented victims of asbestos and sick people, I represented sick buildings to get the asbestos out of the buildings. And when I came down, I had a team and investigators, and our job was just like, you need to figure out who's asbestos up there. We sued a bunch of companies, so we knew it was going to be National Gypsum, W.R. Grace, USG, something of that nature. But we had to really go and work with the trades, work with plasterers, work with scientists, material scientists. We'd fly around and, at midnight sometimes to school buildings because we couldn't do it during the day, had everything, done so we wouldn't cause any exposures, but get up there with microscopists and scientists there to, take samples from those ceilings, look what it is. And also, go into warehouses or barns or basements and looking for old invoices. So when part of what we're talking about is the legal profession, I always say make sure your lawyers and their staff are willing to get dirty. And I mean dirty in a way of dig and not give up when we need to find what we need to do with that. But we also had to learn about the fiber release, and we talked about that today too. It's encapsulated. Oh, it never comes out of those products. It can't get into your breathing zone of that. So the litigation, as it progressed, the new technology that would come around with the microscopes and things, you couldn't see it with the naked eye. We did that experiment of showing you can't see it. So when teachers or people were playing or in the boiler rooms or even working in various trades, if you didn't have that dusty insulation, which even then, the workers may not know there was asbestos in there, you needed to have the scientists to work through it as well. I was blessed as I went through my early career as being the investigator and the one out there in the fields and Department of Labor's and digging up a lot of the documents with Barry Castleman mentioned. I spent years in Library of Congress looking both for historical knowledge documents, but also the historical documents of, well, whose products were out there. And when we talked about all the different things that Dr. Anderson talked about, the mines and the plants and the households and, whose were they? Because the only way we could seek compensation and justice for victims was to have the defendants who were the culpable defendants identified. And I'll talk just briefly about what our ultimate responsibilities are. But it's fair to say as lawyers, we spend time educating, we help legislate, but this is about our role in the litigation on that. I was blessed to have worked also in the 1970s with Ron Motley, who was one of the pioneers, as several other lawyers were, in asbestos litigation. And after about 10 years of married, having kids, and putting off law school, my mentor put me through law school. So I could not now just advocate and look for the documents. I could actually speak in the courtroom and advocate on behalf of victims. And part of our litigation of what we have to do, and if we were teaching a law school class, we'd have to say we have to prove a duty, that the company had a duty, that they breached that duty to the victim. We have to prove that causation, and we have to prove damages. And those are things we'll talk about a little bit more, but the breach of that duty is, did the conduct cause the injury to the person who is bringing the lawsuit on that as well? And then the damages, we talked about that today. We've got to get through those three things. And then the most important thing of this is the story and the damages. And it's not just financial compensation. It's the ability to get your story out there and get compensation for the distress and mental anguish you had on there. When we talked about duty and we talked about the early cases and that we've talked about today, when the earliest cases came out, my partners tried some of those cases and they lost. And that was in the early 70s. Because it wasn't until the mid-70s some of the documents were coming to light. We lost the first cases because they said, well, they didn't know. These companies didn't know anything. And as Barry just indicated, they weren't too forthcoming in saying, oh, yeah, we knew, we just didn't want to tell you and things. So, well, the lawsuits that we lost in the beginning started producing documents when we'd go back and say, well, we maybe didn't have everything that you had in your files there. Some of the earliest documents in 1976 come from the plants in South Carolina that we started our litigations. And I always love to quote one of the first ones from the Sumner-Simpson papers, we call them. They weren't available at the first years of litigation. or the early, at least, cases of litigation. But you had the Asbestos Manhattan Plan, the Sumner Simpson of Asbestos to Vandiver Brown of Johns Manville, 1935. I think the less said about asbestos, the better off we are. Johns Manville, Vandiver Brown replies, I quite agree with you that our interests are best served by having asbestos receive minimum publicity. And for that, and for many other companies who followed, put us in the position where we are in today, where we have that exposure pyramid of asbestos being in the factories and the product users and the bystanders and the housewives who were exposed by the very dust and the children bringing home. For the fact that it wasn't made public, and it was when it started becoming public, there was always something that they could explain away why they shouldn't be liable for a product on that. We couldn't do this litigation without the professionals we've heard throughout the day today. I think when you talk about law firms who take these cases, you've got to know about epidemiology and occupational disease and the public health aspects of all of these things with this too, and microscopy, industrial hygiene, and historian. There's so much at play with this, and we couldn't do it with the work with that. We have to fight the defenses. And again, Barry kind of touched on this a little bit. First, it says, well, asbestos doesn't cause disease. And then it was, well, our asbestos doesn't cause disease. Well, if it's our asbestos that caused disease, if it can cause disease, you weren't exposed to our asbestos. And well, if you were exposed to our asbestos, it wasn't enough and someone else is responsible. So every day we're in court, we're working through those defenses on there and working to say, well, at the end of the day, someone's responsible, and usually we have those folks in the courtroom on that. When I describe what I do for a living to people who maybe haven't been around and looked at this, but it's simple, and it's simple for a number of people in this room. We sue for safety. We help victims tell their story. We help hold corporations accountable. Best way to hold corporations accountable is to shine light into their files, into their documents, into their testimony. You can't do that without a lawsuit. Sometimes you can get a subpoena power to get those, but most of the documents that come to light that have been so damning on the industry, and there's still documents found in so many litigations that are new, which is quite amazing. But shining a light, is what we find some of the documents. And the knowledge that is out there and probably really prevented science even earlier to come about with those. But we're helping the individuals and the companies responsible, and at the end of the day, to prevent this from happening. And I wrote down the quote that you said about your father because it's so impactful. Don't let this happen to other families. It just isn't right, and it can be prevented. And that's our role in the lawsuits. We can't prevent it, what happened to the family. We can't prevent it to the exposures that have occurred and the diseases that will happen, but we can tell a story of what the disaster this is called, and even for other industries that you can't have this again. So when I tell clients when they walk through the door, and what they usually want is they want to tell a story. And we're going to hear more about how you can tell your story. You want to seek justice. You want to hold the companies responsible. You want to ask, how did this happen? And you want to find comfort in knowing that you're working with a firm, or whoever you're working with within their firm has worked with asbestos victims and stand on the shoulders of the work that has been done to others on there. I know we are honored, and for my firm of representing victims and their families, and I can speak for each one of my staff, attorneys, paralegals, investigators, that your stories become their stories, and they gain strength, and I can personally attest to this. When we represent victims of asbestos exposure, the courage that you've put forth to even be brave to bring a lawsuit and to go through the things that Perry and Greg are going to talk about there, it's not easy, but it's just, and it gets your story out, and it's justice for your loved ones. And we're very, very honored when we do represent your families.
Thank you, Ann.
I don't have a lot to add.
You're going to tell us how we do that.
Just so that we're there. Yeah, left.
Yeah.
So I don't have a lot to add. We just learned a lot, but we understand that when we come into the life of someone who's diagnosed with mesothelioma, it is a life-changing, to say the least, moment. And we want them to focus on their medical. So our job is, as has been stated, to put that puzzle of exposure together. We know it's a unique diagnosis and that it is only caused by asbestos exposure. And our job from the moment we start, from the moment we meet the client, is to put that puzzle together through every potential avenue of exposure. And that's what we do. That's really all I have. I think we want to answer some questions if you have any questions.
5 more minutes. That's it. Then we're going to have 2 minutes of
Just going to add a little bit in there.
Cool. Thank you, Greg. Come on, Barry.
Greg, Ann, and I have seen some interesting things. And Dr. Moline was talking about that earlier. When you talk about whether it's an occupational history or an exposure history, it's that puzzle you're talking about. Because if you ask most people, you ever exposed to asbestos? No. You ever talc? No. Okay, we're done. Well, it's not that simple. We're now finding these exposures are also different. Greg's firm represented a lady that had no known exposures, except she was a professional baton twirler. Flaming baton twirler from little kid up to through college, right? A flaming baton that had chrysolite paper on there that she twirled, exposing herself to amphiboles and being poisoned while she was doing it. You don't think of that. We have people that are scientists. They were always in college. They had their biology class, their chemistry class. And what are they handling? Asbestos tongs, asbestos pads, raw asbestos in little bottles for experiments. You wouldn't think that would be enough, and it does. It causes meso. Printers that work on printing presses, they're running millions of pieces of paper through their entire life, being exposed to asbestos in those machines. Do you think of that as an asbestos worker? No. We think of the pictures of Texas with miles and mountains of pipe covering. So it's our job to work with you, to listen to you, to find out what Mr. Duran went through. What did he use? Where was he exposed? And by listening and working with the family, we then come out and ask for your help. We come to the experts and say, we have this individual. This was their exposure. We need some help. We turn to Barry Castleman and say, what documents do you have? We talk to Dr. Lemon about what were the regulations. We talk to Dr. Frank. Well, is this enough exposure? Can you review this exposure history? We asked Dr. Moline to show up at court and Dr. Markowitz to show up at court and all of our other experts to step up and fight. And the important thing for all of you to know is there's a team behind you. You're not in this fight by yourself. Your voice is being heard not only at that deposition, but in that courtroom and in Washington, D.C., and as Harmender was telling us, around the world. That Cape lawsuit in South Carolina right now is opening up new avenues of recovery for people. And the odd part about it is the other defendants are happy it's happening. They're looking forward to blame somebody else. They're looking forward to somebody else to pay part of this, load. So what we're trying to say, and we don't want this to be a message just for our firms, is if you know someone with mesothelioma or someone that is sick, tell them, get a good doctor, and tell them it's okay, get a good law firm. Because behind the law firm are many voices like Linda and ADAO, experts, activists, photographers that are here to help everybody and to fight for this. And what we want to do is help make that a little more comfortable. We're going to be there for you in a non-intrusive way because we're there to help you, help the family, let the family know their security, and that your loved one, when they are ready to pass away, know that everything's going to be okay for the family. I had a client that said, Perry, do you think I can get that roof on the house before I pass away? I'm like, roof? He's like, I've been promising to get that roof fixed for 10 years and I haven't done it. Little thing like that, we got him recovery. He put the roof on. He says, thank you. That's just a roof. But he was so worried about making sure he finally got that done while he's on oxygen, on opioids, and all this, and going through depositions, wanting to know that that can happen. So we're here today to answer any questions you have, but we're also here today to encourage you to encourage others. Get a good doctor, and don't be afraid to hire a good law firm. If you don't hire ours, call Ann's or call the Gorey firm, and you'll be in good hands.
Thank you.
And also Early is a good sponsor too. They do excellent work.
That was excellent. And just so you know, ADAO does not make any legal referrals. I think you heard from Perry. They're not in it to pull in all the chips off the casino tables. They really want to do the right thing for the clients and move forward for justice. And your discovery helps me with policy because I can dig deep and get materials and evidence that I need. Let's open it up to questions. I will ask you guys to be brief. We have 5 minutes-ish for questions. Do we have any? Emily, set to go. Bob.
I'm wondering how you would describe the role of punitive damages in the asbestos story. Has it been important from the standpoint of settlement? Has it been important from the standpoint of changing corporate behavior? Have there been significant punitive damage awards?
I would answer yes. And punitive, it's really when we talk about compensation and accountability, that does go to that second part of accountability. It's seeking justice for the family, but also sending a message to other companies. But so, yeah, there's been a number of punitive damages awards. And basically, at the end of a trial, either during the trial or after it, it could be a separate phase, but the jury will be asked, should we award punitive conduct? Did the conduct rise to a certain level to say, okay, you've taken care of the compensation for the plaintiff, you've dealt with the mental anguish, did the company do something so bad that they should be penalized? And it's often done either just by $2 million, $5 million, $200 million, or in some trials I've been involved in when they're consolidated trials, it'll be for every verdict that comes in, it's a 3 times more multiplier. So short answer is punitive damage is very important. The court has to allow us to go through it. Does it send a message eventually? I mean, the whole thing is supposed to hit them in the pocketbook where it hurts. So that's why you have the punitive damages there. I hope some of the CEOs pay attention to it. Can't guarantee it if they can pay for it, but I think it reads loud and clear when it's in the newspapers on that and does send a message. Perry, you may have.
Well, and a great example of an unnamed baby powder company that was getting nailed with punitive damages. They went to non-asbestos talc in their baby powder. It's now cornstarch. First it was in the United States, and they were still going to sell it overseas. And then, public pressure and all the activism got into it. But those punitive damage awards, that was a current modern day existence, not something going back from use that was done in 76. So it absolutely has an impact.
And that's why the documents are important, to find those documents, see what they were hiding, see what they were doing. And, people get really mad on that.
Advocacy in the law was seen very well, I think, with Johnson & Johnson, where us as women, women of minority, we fought hard. We raised a lot of stink, and ultimately we were able to get Johnson & Johnson to pull the baby powder out of international markets. They pulled out of the U.S., but then they were still peddling that junk. And I think it shows how your evidence allows us to do more effective advocacy. We have time for one more question. Yes, Nicole.
Yes, thanks. My question is on proprietary agreements, like, in products and consumer products. How much are they able to actually hide in that? And what is how do you take on that if you are going to take on a case and they've hidden it in there, in there somewhere?
I was going to say, you can bury it as much as you want. Eventually, the truth's going to come out. You can put it in proprietary documents, confidential documents, but these things do get out there. I mean, Barry's been the master of finding documents that go back, way back when, and there's been court orders opening that up. Some of the harder ones are when, it's covered by federal contractor defenses, where it's current, military secrets. And in those circumstances, the courts may order that they disclose it, but they have to be kept confidential, and they're only used in that specific trial. And that's hard because eventually that may go public if you're going to be trying it. So they can bury it, but it's not an effective way. It's going to come out.
And I think it only comes into play maybe when they call it a trade secret or something with that too. And that's usually for something that's still on the market. So it would involve some products out there. For products that are no longer on the market, they need to, if there's an interrogator who says, how much asbestos do you have in your product? You need to say how much asbestos was in your product. And then some states, it's maybe state to state, but the sunshine laws that they have, if it's a public health issue and something that should be closed to the public health, you can't hide around the fact that, well, I don't want to tell anybody that asbestos is in my product. So there's all different disclosure things there as well. On that too, but a lot of other industries have trade secrets on that, but I don't see that in asbestos. They're usually compelled to have to provide the information.
And also what Bob was talking about earlier, these regulations that require disclosure of what's out there, what's in place, what's being used. That's where, again, the legislation and the lawsuits come in.
And we're not going to let them claim CBI on Part 1 and asbestos reporting rule. We are going to dog them to tell us the truth at all lengths, right, Bob?